Hello, everyone, our dear listeners who have been following along with us. Today, I invite you to listen to a story that isn't new, but every time it's retold, it strikes a painful chord. A story without gunfire, yet smoldering like embers beneath ashes in the heart of the region. And at the center lies a painful paradox. The one who once saved nouns themselves as bands abandoned by those they saved. This story begins with a simple, yet deeply troubling question. Why is Vietnam silent? While Cambodia grapples with crisis from border tensions to economic troubles to internal political turmoil, their social media platforms are flooded with criticism aimed at Vietnam. TikTok, Facebook, YouTube overflow with videos, posts, and comments labeling Vietnam as heartless, standing by without intervening, even calling it an opportunistic bystander. Young Cambodians, born after the war and never having witnessed the bloodshed of those years, are now being swept up in a wave of skewed collective emotion. They forget, or perhaps never knew, that Vietnam once sacrificed over 40,000 of its sons and daughters to help Cambodia escape one of the most brutal regimes in human history, the Khmer Rouge. And now, when Vietnam chooses silence, that very silence becomes the target of condemnation. But is Vietnam truly indifferent? Or is this silence a quiet, profound, and strategic counterstrike? A nation cannot forever act on emotion. It cannot roll up its sleeves every time a neighbor cries for help. It cannot continue sacrificing present and future interests out of loyalty to past bonds, especially when that neighbor has repeatedly broken trust. And more importantly, in today's calculated geopolitical chessboard, silence is sometimes the clearest form of expression. Vietnam is not speaking out. No declarations, no criticisms. But what's unfolding on the southwestern border, the movements in southern Laos and Cambodia, the quiet agreements on logistics, energy, healthcare, education, all reveal one thing. Vietnam is not indifferent. Vietnam is acting, just not in the way social media demands. We live in an age where public emotion is easily manipulated, where a single hashtag can drown out historical truth, and where a single post can erase an entire chapter of suffering written in blood. But truth, even when forgotten, still exists. It still lies there, quietly waiting to be remembered, not for glory, but to safeguard historical justice from distortion. Amidst the waves of criticism, perhaps many young Cambodians don't know or choose to forget that in 1978, when the whole world turned its back, when the United Nations looked away, when global powers chose silence, it was Vietnam, and only Vietnam, that sent troops into Cambodia to end the Khmer Rouge genocide. No one honored them. No one thanked them. On the contrary, Vietnam was accused of invasion, sanctioned, isolated. A generation had its path to development cut off simply because it chose to stand on the side of justice alone. So today, when Vietnam remains silent, it is not out of apathy. It is a reminder that goodwill cannot be endlessly misplaced. That sacrifice, if not grounded in strategy, will sooner or later become a pretext for exploitation. Silence, because Vietnam understands that this time not everyone deserves to be saved, and that not every moment calls for a hasty hero. Behind this silence lies a lesson paid in blood, a strength of wisdom and resolve, and a silent message sent to the entire region. Vietnam may not speak, but every move is calculated. And this time, it is the silence that compels the region to listen. We've heard enough criticism, we've seen enough angry videos, we've witnessed enough emotion overpowering reason. Now it's time to revisit an old chapter, one that many try to forget, but one Vietnam must never be allowed to forget. It's the chapter titled 1978, When Vietnam Acted Alone. December 1978. While the entire world turned its back, Vietnam, a nation just emerging from war, still bearing unhealed scars, made a bold and solitary decision: to march into Cambodia. Not for glory, not for territory, but because it could not turn a blind eye to what the Khmer Rouge was doing to its own people. At that time, Cambodia was no longer a nation, it was a killing machine. The Pol Pot regime turned rice fields into execution grounds, temples into torture chambers, and even infants too young to speak became victims. Refugees fleeing across the border into Vietnam brought horrifying tales: mothers buried alive in front of their children, men hacked to pieces as an example, women enslaved for Khmer Rouge soldiers' pleasure before being killed. Each passing day, hundreds, even thousands of desperate Cambodians crossed the southwestern border, their eyes pleading for help, but the world gave no answer. China was secretly backing the Khmer Rouge. The United States, having just pulled out of Vietnam, wanted no involvement in another conflict. The Soviet Union was not yet ready to offer deep support. ASEAN, then a fledgling regional bloc, chose to remain on the sidelines. Never before had Vietnam stood so alone on the international stage. And yet, in that isolation, a decision was made, one rooted in humanity that would change the fate of an entire people. Within just weeks of the campaign, Phnom Penh was liberated. The death camps dismantled. Survivors felt as if they'd been born again, and the world was forced to face the truth. Had Vietnam not acted, there would be no Cambodia left to speak of. But instead of being recognized as a humanitarian mission, Vietnam was branded an invader. Western newspapers labeled the war an armed intervention, a new form of expansionism. The United Nations passed resolutions condemning Vietnam. Major powers cut aid and tightened sanctions. In a double blow, supporting troops in Cambodia while enduring global punishment, Vietnam spiraled into a near decade-long crisis. No one stood with Vietnam. No voice dared defend the truth. Isolation forced a generation of Vietnamese to grow up in poverty, hardship, and frustration. But the deepest wound wasn't the world's punishment. It was the forgetfulness of those who had been saved. When the convoys withdrew from Phnom Penh, there was no farewell, no words of thanks, no formal acknowledgement from the Cambodian government. In fact, many Cambodians, misled by distorted history or poor education, came to believe Vietnam had invaded Cambodia. They didn't know, or chose not to know, that over 40,000 Vietnamese soldiers had died on their soil, a generation sacrificed in silence. Unmentioned, uncommemorated. Vietnamese cemeteries in Cambodia grew moss-covered over time. Tombstones with no names, only hastily etched inscriptions. Killed in action, 1980, fell near the Mekong, identity unknown, still lie there, solemn witnesses to a noble act that was gravely misunderstood. And from here, we step into the next part, a question that pierces the heart. What is the price of goodwill? Is it the more than 40,000 lives that never returned home? Is it a nation sanctioned, isolated, abandoned between justice and geopolitical calculation? And if goodwill is forgotten, distorted, or exploited, should we continue sacrificing without strategy? We must look deeper to understand the terrible cost Vietnam paid for choosing to save a dying nation. A cost not only in blood, but in decades of lost progress, in a whole generation trapped under the weight of punishment. That is the story we will tell next. The price of goodwill, over 40,000 lives and a sanctioned generation. No sacrifice is ever easy, but some sacrifices go unrecognized, and the most brutal of all is when they are misunderstood. More than 40,000 Vietnamese soldiers fell on Cambodian soil over nearly a decade of fulfilling an international duty. This wasn't the tally of a short campaign, but the result of long, grueling years in which Vietnam simultaneously defended its own borders, helped rebuild a shattered nation, and faced brutal counterattacks from remnants of the Khmer Rouge. War isn't just about guns and bullets. It's about logistics, food supplies, medicine, and technical personnel. From 1979 through the early 1990s, Vietnam sustained a fledgling Cambodian government, trained cadres, rebuilt infrastructure, and re-established administrative and educational systems. And all of this while Vietnam itself was suffocating under sanctions. Immediately after sending troops into Cambodia, Vietnam was hit with sweeping sanctions from the West. The US and its allies cut aid and froze diplomatic ties. International financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank refused assistance. Even some ASEAN nations viewed Vietnam warily, fearing a wave of communist expansion from the north. Every path to development was blocked. Vietnam entered a prolonged period of stagnation. No resources, no investment, no international dialogue. A generation came of age burdened by the consequences of a noble decision, one made without international backing. Soldiers died, yet had no portraits honored in tradition rooms. Mothers lost sons, yet received no timely certificate of national recognition. A country bore the burden, but was labeled an invader. And the world remained silent, turned away, or pointed fingers. There's a saying that's often repeated: had Vietnam not intervened, Cambodia might no longer exist. But the paradox is this: that very act of salvation nearly cost Vietnam its own future. Out of goodwill, Vietnam accepted a monumental price, more than 40,000 lives, and a decade locked out of global progress. Worse yet, as history fades over time, as new generations grow up without being properly taught the painful and meaningful chapters of the past, that goodwill is not just forgotten, it is distorted. Liberation becomes invasion. International duty is twisted into expansionist ambition. Historical revisionism, toxic narratives, and a generation led astray by misinformation have transformed Vietnam's image in Cambodian eyes. No longer the brother who once extended a saving hand, but a shadowy figure, even a potential enemy. And perhaps what pains the Vietnamese most is not the sacrifice itself, but that the sacrifice has been forgotten so callously, smeared so coldly. When one person forgets a debt of gratitude, it's sorrowful. But when an entire generation is taught not to believe in it, that is tragedy. We do not demand gratitude. History does not need empty thank yous. But history must be seen truthfully, and the losses endured must be remembered as part of the truth, not twisted into a weapon, not manipulated to stir hate, not used to build an enemy image. And yet, tragically, Cambodian social media today is witnessing a storm of emotion devoid of reason. Viral videos shared tens of thousands of times, bitter posts, accusatory and offensive comments, all becoming tools of some hidden force, channeling public anger into a political weapon. From historical amnesia, they begin to rewrite the present. Vietnam is recast as the bystander, the indifferent one, the cold neighbor. Those who've never lived through war, never seen real suffering, now shout empty moral slogans, forgetting that their very lives today were once bought with someone else's blood. This is no longer pure emotion. It is emotion being used in place of analysis, of reason, of geopolitics. And that is precisely what we must examine next. When social media outrage is no longer a natural reaction, but a tool to steer public opinion. When feelings are used to distort strategic maps. And when people who once owed each other blood now push one another into the shadows of hate. We need to dig deeper to see the true face of the rising wave flooding the digital world. And that will be the focus of the next part, the rage of social media, when emotion replaces geopolitics. We are living in an era where a 30-second video clip can reshape how an entire generation sees history. In Cambodia today, there's no need for an official policy to rewrite the past. Just a few TikTok accounts, a few emotional Facebook posts, or a cleverly edited video series are enough to distort Vietnam's image. And the most dangerous part? Many believe it without question. A young Cambodian today may have never read a single official document about the southwestern border war. They may have never heard their parents speak of the horrific years under the Khmer Rouge, but they can scroll through their phones, see a caption that reads, "Vietnam only helped Cambodia to seize land," or watch a sorrowful voice ask, "Why won't Vietnam save us again?" And just like that, they become angry. They judge. They condemn. This anger doesn't come from understanding. It doesn't come from lived experience. It stems from a vague sense of betrayal, passed around on social media like a virus, uncontrolled and contagious. Emotion is stirred, directed, and used as a weapon. And when that weapon falls into the hands of those without historical grounding, led by collective sentiment, its power to destroy may be even greater than an actual army. When did collective emotion begin replacing strategic analysis? When did a country like Vietnam, once willing to shed blood to save others, come to be seen as a selfish neighbor? Perhaps it began when platforms like TikTok and Facebook became the main arenas for shaping public opinion in Cambodia. And when those operating behind the scenes of social media realized the emotion of the masses is the perfect Trojan horse to pierce the barriers of geopolitical awareness. There's no need to distort facts through documents, just stir emotions. Plant a seed of doubt in the hearts of the young, a bit of suspicion, a bit of imagined betrayal, and that's enough to transform them into a raging crowd, ready to hurl stones at the very nation that once saved them. What's most painful is that this outrage doesn't stop at online debates. It slowly seeps into the social psyche. From classrooms to cafes, from casual conversations to small protests, people begin speaking of Vietnam as a bystander, a neighbor who no longer cares. Meanwhile, Vietnam, once again, chooses silence. Not to worsen the situation, not to fall into the trap of inflammatory words. And perhaps this is the most troubling part. Because if it were just spontaneous anger, it might still be forgivable. But when that anger is organized, nurtured, deliberately repeated, then it is no longer simple emotion. It is an attack, silent, calculated, and alarmingly effective. And here, we must ask the question, who is behind this wave? Who stands to gain when Cambodians resent Vietnam? Who is quietly sowing the seeds of distrust between two peoples who once stood shoulder to shoulder in life and death? There's little need for speculation. We all know there is a power highly skilled at wielding collective emotion as a strategic tool. A nation with a long tradition of media infiltration, of creating imaginary enemies to manipulate spheres of influence. A master chess player that rarely moves troops, but whose every move leaves a visible mark, China. And so we enter the next chapter, one that will feel all too familiar to those who have followed Beijing's strategies. China, behind the curtain, a psychological game, where the emotions of the Cambodian people become opening moves, where Vietnam's silence is tested, and where a war without gunfire is ignited by a crowd whose anger has been programmed. In the chessboard of Southeast Asia, some moves make no sound, yet shake the entire game. And no one plays that kind of chess more skillfully than China. China doesn't need to publicly criticize Vietnam. It doesn't have to make loud declarations in defense of Cambodia. It doesn't need to send troops or call emergency meetings, but look closely and you'll see. Every wave of Cambodian public outrage is invisibly serving Beijing's interests, while slowly chipping away at something Vietnam has spent decades safeguarding: regional unity. China is executing a sophisticated psychological game, not with missiles, not with warships, but with collective emotion, distorted information, and strategic silence. Beijing says nothing. It simply sits back and lets Cambodian social media do the rest. In this game, Cambodia is the launch pad, but Vietnam is the ultimate target. As the wave of protest, slander, and distortion against Vietnam spreads in Cambodia, Hanoi is cornered into a dilemma. If it speaks out, it risks being accused of interference. If it stays silent, it's labeled indifferent. If it takes action, it could walk right into China's trap, providing Beijing with the perfect narrative that Vietnam is threatening regional security. This is a trial by fire, a test of resolve, and China is waiting for Vietnam to lose patience. Beijing knows that Vietnam, given its strategic location, isn't easily cowed by military or economic pressure. But if China can undermine Vietnam's credibility right in its own backyard, if it can make the Cambodian people doubt the very neighbor who once saved them, then it won't need to fire a single shot to destabilize one of the key pillars of regional balance. That's why Beijing quietly fans the flames of resentment, backs agenda-driven media outlets, and even funds shadowy lobbying groups in Phnom Penh to keep Vietnam's image under a cloud of suspicion and to ensure that trust between the two nations can never be fully restored. We've seen this playbook before, in Myanmar, in the Philippines, in Laos, places where China doesn't attack head-on, but chips away layer by layer, with conditional investments, guided media narratives, and people-friendly campaigns that ultimately isolate local governments. And now, Cambodia is the next card. Vietnam, if it reacts rashly, risks being cast as the aggressor in a script already written by Beijing. Vietnam understands this, and rather than walk into a head-on confrontation, it chooses a different move: deliberate neutrality. No accusations, no fueling the fire, no getting swept up in the tide of public outrage. Vietnam knows that, right now, calm is the true expression of strategic strength, and precisely what China doesn't expect. And from here we move to the next part, where silence is no longer a sign of weakness, but the clearest declaration of Vietnam's position and mindset. Strategic neutrality, when saying nothing, says the most. A response without words, yet one that can shift the entire game. A strategy that forces the region to pause and reconsider. Who is truly leading this game with clarity and responsibility? Silence does not mean weakness. Avoiding confrontation does not mean fear. And not speaking out, sometimes, is the loudest way to speak. In the current Cambodia-Thailand crisis, while social media rages and calls for Vietnam to act, intervene, or speak up echo endlessly from Cambodian public opinion, Vietnam continues to choose a silence that reflects true composure. No rebuttals, no endorsements, no flashy statements, just quietly observing, analyzing, and methodically repositioning each piece on the regional chessboard. This is not indifference. It is strategic neutrality, the calm of a country seasoned enough to know there are moments when words are traps, and silence, when wielded correctly, can disorient opponents more than any threat ever could. Vietnam understands this well. In a region where nations are often swept up in political whirlwinds, divided by superpower pressure, lured by promises of loans and infrastructure, maintaining a neutral stance is not passivity. It's a form of soft power that demands endurance, patience, and razor-sharp clarity. No one hears Vietnam speak, yet Vietnamese technical teams are present in southern Laos and eastern Cambodia. Medical aid, education support, infrastructure development continue to flow steadily. Cadre training, logistics support, supply chain connections, all quietly underway with no need for grand announcements. Vietnam isn't speaking, but it is acting, and acting deeply. Vietnam also makes no proclamations about supporting either side in the Cambodia-Thai land dispute, yet is simultaneously strengthening regional cooperation with Thailand in areas such as cybersecurity, soft defense, regional logistics, power grid connectivity, and cross-border transport. Meanwhile, along its border with Cambodia, Vietnam is ramping up soft control, boosting humanitarian cooperation, and directly linking trade with communities affected by the conflict. This is how influence is built, not with gunfire, but through quiet, persistent, and hard-to-dislodge action. While many countries chase slogan geopolitics, eager to stake out quick positions to please domestic opinion or specific voter blocs, Vietnam opts for the silent map strategy, redrawing influence through controlled, unswayed action. It's not just a wise choice, it's a sign that Vietnam is entering a new phase of strategic maturity in its foreign policy. Because a nation that knows exactly who it is, where it stands, and where it's headed, has no need to shout for attention. Vietnam understands that a voice of true weight doesn't come from a loudspeaker, but from stability, capacity for action, and the trust it earns from the region. And precisely because of this composed approach, as Cambodia spirals deeper into instability, Vietnam's role within ASEAN only grows more prominent. When Vietnam speaks at international forums, people listen not because it's loud, but because it's steady. While Cambodia disrupts ASEAN's consensus, Vietnam, on the contrary, is becoming a pillar holding the bloc together. And that brings us to the next analysis: ASEAN, consensus, and Cambodia's shaking seat, where Phnom Penh's reckless decisions are coming at a cost, while Vietnam, through calm, calculated silence, retains a quiet leadership role within the entire bloc. In ASEAN, where every member is a piece in a round table of consensus, Cambodia was once seen as the youngest sibling. Small but loved, poor but given opportunities. Yet precisely because of that, every move it makes outside the shared trajectory becomes all the more glaring and risks shaking its seat at the table. Over the past decade, as ASEAN has faced increasingly complex challenges, from the South China Sea disputes, US-China rivalry, climate change, like to trade and digital transformation, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand have stood as anchors, keeping the rhythm steady. Cambodia, on more than one occasion, has been the offbeat note in the chorus. We cannot forget 2012, when, during Cambodia's rotating ASEAN chairmanship, the bloc, for the first time in its history, failed to issue a joint communiqué after the foreign ministers' meeting. Why? Because Cambodia insisted on excluding the South China Sea issue from the statement, citing lack of consensus. But everyone knew the truth behind that silence: the growing influence of China, a non-ASEAN member, yet powerful enough to bend the voice of one. It didn't stop there. Time and again, Cambodia has leaned toward China on key issues, from infrastructure investment and trade to political forums, while Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines struggled to defend their maritime sovereignty. Cambodia remained silent. And that silence, unlike Vietnam's strategic quiet, was a tacit endorsement of China, making Cambodia's ASEAN seat increasingly isolated. The world has changed. ASEAN is changing too. No longer just a loose alliance, ASEAN is gradually redefining its strategic role regionally and globally. In this process, every member must ask, who do I want to be in this bloc? A contributor or a burden? A companion or the one being dragged along? For years, Cambodia has seemingly clung to a protected status mindset, leaning on China for funding, on ASEAN for legitimacy, and on Vietnam for security. But in today's world, there is no room for one-way relationships. One cannot expect ASEAN to speak up in defense of Cambodia during conflict. if Cambodia has repeatedly turned its back on the bloc's common voice. Vietnam, which has time and again extended support to Cambodia economically and militarily, cannot carry the weight of a relationship that only goes one way. Cambodia cannot keep running to Vietnam in times of crisis, only to then silence its own voice when ASEAN needs unity, just to appease Beijing. Every one-sided act of goodwill must eventually be reassessed. And now, with tensions flaring between Cambodia and Thailand, with Phnom Penh's international reputation faltering due to inconsistent policies, with foreign investors pulling out, and with growing internal distrust, Cambodia's seat at ASEAN is truly shaking. Not because of Vietnam, not because of Thailand, but because of what Cambodia itself has chosen and neglected for years. Meanwhile, Vietnam, with calm and clear strategy, is increasingly asserting its role within the bloc. No noise, no battles for the spotlight. Yet trust in Vietnam at ASEAN summits, in regional alliances for security, logistics, energy, and digital transformation is steadily growing. These programs continue with or without Cambodia, and that reality speaks louder than any diplomatic statement. From a broader view, it's clear that ASEAN is entering a quiet restructuring, where relationships built on real trust will endure, while loose, one-sided, emotional alliances will be gradually weeded out by the system itself. And so the unavoidable question resurfaces. What does Cambodia truly want to be in this bloc? An independent member with its own voice and responsible foreign policy, or merely a chess piece moved by outside hands? A true ally, or a dependent actor living in the illusion of borrowed power? The answer won't come from ASEAN, nor from Vietnam. It must come from Phnom Penh itself, because the time has come for Cambodia to choose: ally, pawn, or a truly independent nation. And that will be the focus of the next chapter, where we revisit all that Cambodia has wagered and lost. Cambodia now stands at a historic crossroads, where every choice will not only shape its internal political future, but also profoundly influence its place in the regional and global order. For years, Phnom Penh has seemingly chosen a path, leaning on China as a financial crutch, a powerful patron, and a partner willing to pour in money without asking for democracy, human rights, or transparency. With Chinese-funded special economic zones, highways, seaports, and most notably, the Ream naval base, Cambodia has traded short-term growth for long-term dependency. It's undeniable that China has helped reshape Cambodia's landscape over the past decade. But the price is becoming increasingly evident: loss of policy autonomy, mounting debt risks, and perhaps most damaging, the erosion of international trust. By allowing a Chinese military presence at the Ream naval base, Cambodia sent the wrong signal to ASEAN and the international community that Phnom Penh is willing to become a pawn in Beijing's strategic game. This is no longer a mutually beneficial partnership. It's a new form of dependency, where a small nation trades away independence for borrowed commitments, hastily built projects, and no-strings aid laced with political obligations. Meanwhile, other options still exist, but they're narrowing. Cambodia could still choose to be friends with many, to strike a balance among China, ASEAN, the US, Japan, and even Vietnam. It could embrace a path of independence, leveraging its central location to connect the Indochina subregion instead of becoming a pit stop for external powers. But that would require political courage, long-term vision, and the resolve to step out from under the shadow of a big friend. More importantly, Cambodia needs to re-examine its relationship with Vietnam. The neighbor who once shed blood to save its people, who helped rebuild its government, who extended aid during natural disasters and pandemics, and who remained patient through suspicion, neglect, and distortion. Vietnam does not need Cambodia to bow in gratitude, but any meaningful relationship must be rebuilt on mutual respect, historical understanding, and real political goodwill. A true ally cannot be the one who turns away when needed, only to come running in times of crisis. The friendship between nations, if it's to survive, cannot rely on the past alone. It must be nurtured in the present and shaped by a vision for the future. And that future can only be sustainable if Cambodia steps out of its pawn-like role, refuses to be anyone's backyard, and builds the confidence to act as a truly independent nation. Vietnam can wait. Vietnam can be patient. But it cannot continue carrying a neighbor who keeps repeating the same wrong choices. And while Cambodia vacillates between being an ally A pawn or an independent state, Vietnam has already moved forward. It is carving out a new position, not just within ASEAN, but across the broader regional structure. Because in times of chaos, it is the one who stays calm, who remains clear-headed, and who acts with strategy that becomes the true leader. And that brings us to the next chapter, Vietnam's new position, the regional balancer. When the region is shaken by disputes, influence games, temptations, and division, a nation that chooses no side, makes no noise, and owes no allegiance suddenly becomes the anchor others look to. Amid Southeast Asia's churn of geopolitical undercurrents, while Cambodia grapples with internal crisis, Thailand shakes under border tensions, and major powers like China, the US, and Japan deepen their footprints in the region, Vietnam, quietly but resolutely, is emerging as the regional balancer, a new anchor drawing the gaze of the entire region, not through flashy declarations, not with boastful military might, not by emotional appeals. Vietnam has chosen a different path, one of stability, clarity, and long-term strategy. While many nations scramble to pick sides or sway between loans, promises, and pressure from global powers, Vietnam stands firm, cooperative, but with deliberate distance. Look at the regional map and the reality becomes clear. Vietnam sits at a critical geographic and strategic junction. To the north is China, its historical rival. To the east, the South China Sea, a flashpoint of sovereignty disputes and global shipping lanes. To the west, Laos and Cambodia, both under Vietnamese influence and increasingly unstable. To the south, routes connecting ASEAN to the Indian Ocean. Any geopolitical ripple in the region converges at Vietnam's doorstep. And instead of resisting it alone, Vietnam has turned itself into a regulator. It tempers China's pressure with unwavering sovereignty defense. It manages Western influence with controlled openness and principled integration. It stabilizes intra-ASEAN relations with a calm yet credible voice, because Vietnam is one of the few countries that can speak to all sides without suspicion. At ASEAN's high-level military, security, and logistics forums, Vietnam's name no longer lingers at the end of the list as a token member. It's often called to speak first, representing the stable and neutral bloc. On the global stage in the UN, APEC, and expanded G20, Vietnam is regularly cited as a country that grows under pressure, maintains independence amid complexity, and sustains its voice amidst noisy confrontation. This composure didn't come naturally. It was forged through a history of isolation, sacrifices made for justice, being misunderstood by the world, and failures from misplaced trust. That's why today, Vietnam doesn't rush to conclusions. It doesn't chase trends, and it refuses to let emotion steer its policies. Instead of diving into the Cambodia-Thailand conflict, Vietnam strengthens logistics at its western borders, increases civil presence, and delivers targeted aid. Rather than publicly criticizing Cambodia, Vietnam expands ties with Laos, Indonesia, and the Philippines, creating a new triangle of influence that Cambodia must reckon with, lest it be left behind. Instead of loudly declaring regional leadership, Vietnam acts step by step, quietly but effectively, prompting international observers to ask, who is truly ASEAN's stabilizing center? As China rolls out sweeping initiatives in supply chains, infrastructure, and regional trade, Vietnam participates but on its terms. It refuses unfavorable conditions, avoids tilting too far. As the US and EU expand economic ties, Vietnam becomes ASEAN's most prolific FTA signatory, yet never allows itself to be dragged into confrontational geopolitics. And while Cambodia loses trust, Myanmar is isolated, Thailand is in turmoil, and Laos remains fragile, Vietnam, with quiet resolve and capability, is gradually filling that trust gap in ASEAN and among its global partners. This is no miracle. It stems from a national choice to never trade sovereignty for growth, to never sacrifice strategy for short-term handshakes, to never abandon principles for sweet-talking promises. In a world spinning from division, instability, and weaponized information, resilience is a precious asset. And Vietnam, though never claiming to lead, is steadily stepping into exactly that role, the region's balancer, the subtle orchestrator, the silent leader. And the time will come when those who once doubted, turned away, or called Vietnam the cold neighbor will look back not with surprise, but with a quiet recognition that in its silence, Vietnam has gone farther than anyone. And if Vietnam is now holding the region's rhythm with poise and responsibility, then it's time we ask, where is Cambodia? The country once rescued, once walked alongside, on this new map. That will be when the final message is spoken, not in anger, not in regret, but with the fortitude of a nation that knows the cost of goodwill and has chosen not to repeat old mistakes. It's time to say this, quietly, without fanfare, without accusation, but clearly and decisively. Vietnam's silence all this time is not indifference. It's a reminder, a message, a final warning to those who have grown used to taking goodwill for granted and who mistake patience for weakness. Vietnam once stood up when the whole world turned away, once bore burdens that weren't its own, once sacrificed blood and lives to save a nation teetering on the edge of extinction. But history is not a book to be flipped at will, nor is it a mirror to be distorted by those who fabricate stories, incite emotion, or manipulate public opinion. If in the past Vietnam acted in the name of justice, then today it chooses silence in the name of strategy. Silence, not out of apathy, but to avoid being pulled into an emotional game where every word can be twisted, clipped, and weaponized by others. Vietnam has spoken too much, done too much, and in return has been met with cruel silence, even denial from those it once saved. This time is different. No more emotional appeals, no more unconditional handshakes, no more quiet aid deliveries, because if a nation does not wish to save itself, then no one, not even those who once bled for it, can save it. Cambodia must now face the consequences of its own choices. It can continue down the path of dependency, continue placing its faith in Beijing's promises, continue believing the illusion that it controls the game, when in reality it is being moved like a cheap piece on someone else's board. Or it can awaken, revisit its history, confront the truth, and find a new path, one of independence, mutual respect, and sustainable growth. But whatever Cambodia chooses, Vietnam will not return to the mindset of 1978. It will not act out of pure sentiment. It will not intervene out of blind loyalty. It will not rush in to fix others' mistakes without weighing long-term consequences. The lessons of the past were paid for in blood. And today, Vietnam is wiser, sharper, and clearer on where responsibility ends and a restraint begins. And that clarity is not coldness. Vietnam still extends its hand to those who genuinely seek partnership, still welcomes cooperation with those who share its vision for a peaceful, stable, and sovereign Southeast Asia. But Vietnam also has the resolve to walk away when necessary, to protect its position from being exploited, and to avoid becoming collateral in someone else's reckless move. We don't need to shout to prove our standing. We don't need to argue to claim what's right. In a world where truth is increasingly twisted, it is quiet, consistent, purpose-driven action that speaks the loudest. And that's what Vietnam is doing. Not making bold declarations, but quietly recalibrating spheres of influence. Not assigning blame, but reinforcing strategic links. Not provoking, but staying prepared. Not loud, but reshaping the regional architecture, step by step, with a strength and composure no one expected. In today's game, those who speak the most are not necessarily in control. Sometimes the one who stays silent at the right moment is the one who's actually leading the entire board. If you've listened this far, thank you, not just for your patience, but for journeying with us to the very end of a difficult story. But it's a truth we, those who care about the region, about our nation's destinies, about a fair order, must confront. We do not tell this story to shock or to divide any nation. We share this analysis so you can see who is truly silent and who is silent yet steering the entire game. If this perspective resonates with you, please support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Because only a thoughtful community can help build a stronger region. And only by understanding our history can we avoid being misled by illusions of the future. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in our next analysis.